Everybody knows that name from pheasants and stuff like that. But anyway, I'll let Dave introduce himself because he's got some slides talking a little bit about his background and stuff, and I'm sure he'll do a way better job than I could ever do. So, he did take me sucker hunting a week ago, and the blisters are starting to heal. So, thank you. But anyway, Dave Dahlgren.
Thank you, Terry. Glad to be here. I'm really glad Jason brought the visual display for us and inspire us and talk about forest grouse. As I prepared this talk, I was thinking about, I was looking back through some of the reports and stuff that I've seen out of the division, and I saw a 1986 research report, or a research priority list, and from the upland game. Were you in 1986?
No, that was before my time.
Before you.
Yeah.
And a blue grouse research project was at the top of the list. And so I kind of been thinking about that as I've prepared this talk here. I know, so this is what we're going to do. I'll give you a little introduction about myself. I know most of you in the room, but there's some new faces to me, and so I kind of want to talk about that. We'll talk about a little forest grouse biology, some of the conservation needs, and then we'll go into some harvest data and information that comes out of the upland game reports. So I grew up in North Dakota, in Bismarck. I got my driver's license just after CRP was initiated. And so this is what I did through most of high school. I hunted pheasants. And that's part of the reason I'm even standing here today is the opportunities that I had as a kid and young man to go out and experience hunting in the field, and specifically for pheasants. They were my target of choice. I also hunt big game and all that kind of stuff, but that's kind of where it started. I came after a little bit of junior college. I came to Utah State University. I did my undergrad there. Then I worked for a little bit, came back and did a master's there. Then I did a PhD there, and then I did a postdoc there. So I'm about as inbred, true blue Aggie as it gets. But happy to have the experiences I've had at Utah State. After my postdoc, I went to the Kansas Department of Wildlife, their state agency, and I was a small game specialist, so I was a statewide coordinator. And I oversaw the pheasant program, the quail program, and I worked a lot with lesser prairie chickens as their conservation issues were building here recently. And just absolutely loved my job working for the state. And I'd spent all these years in academia, and to go out and actually see it and see things implemented on the ground, it was an incredible experience for me. And I spent almost 4 years doing that. And then I came back to Utah State to work in extension. When I was in Kansas, what I got to see was the North American model being implemented on the ground and being put in place, both through funding and personnel. And I just came to appreciate this model, both for how it's being applied now and for those in the past who set this up. The foresight of those who set up PR funding and EJ funding is just an amazing thing to me. And I really support and love this model. Now, that doesn't mean there's not holes in it. And I think actually state agencies are the ones that probably know that the best because they work with it all the time, of where some of those limitations are. When I was in Kansas, I had the opportunity to be on a couple other graduate student committees at different universities in Kansas and one in Oklahoma. And I saw this discrepancy between kind of where academia was headed and where the state agency was headed, and kind of the needs, and sometimes we weren't hitting at the same level. And because I saw that and participated in that, that's one of the reasons that I came back to USU, especially in extension, was a state agency needs applied research that they can take out on the ground. And that's one of the things that extension provides. If we produce something, it has to, a manager should be able to take it and use it right away. And I saw that. I also saw the funding issues. So these professors come into the universities, they're expected to get tenure and bring in contracts and grants. And that funding source largely is federal dollars. And it's largely due to ecology type of funding sources and conservation biology. And so that's kind of driving, they want to be successful and get their tenure and do these things. And what I saw was a niche for me, a place where I could come in and provide some things to state agencies, to applied management here at Utah State. And so that's what I'm hoping to do with my career. Okay, moving on to some of the biology. And don't be afraid to interrupt if you want to have a question or have a discussion as we go along. So here's the range of blue grouse, which has been split, and we'll talk in a minute, into dusky and sooty grouse. And so you can see, so this is a dusky grouse here. It's got the red patch for when it's breeding, the male. And you can see there's not much distinction for the tail band versus the sooty, which has a yellow patch and a very distinct tail band. So this was a study put out by Barrowclough in 2004. What they found was two basic clades. First is the red and then the blue. There was 3 subspecies, but what they came out with was a coastal species and an interior species. So sooties are the coastal and the interior were duskies. And there is this kind of split between north and south. There's also this really weird thing going on in New Mexico, and they didn't know what to do with it. So, but it fit kind of closer to the duskies than it did to the sooties. So when we look at the research history on these 2 species, the sooties is pretty rich. When you look at blue grouse research and what's out there, the vast majority of it is coming out of the coastal stuff. Folks like Bendel and Zwickel just have a long history of doing research. We have very little research right now on duskies and an understanding. And as I go through the biology, a lot of that's going to come from what we know about sooties, and we're going to assume that we know that some of that's going on with duskies, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, dusky seasonal habitat during the breeding, and what I'm presenting here is anecdotal. It's stuff I've seen and talked to people who've seen, but they tend to come down into these transition zones between like the aspen and the sagebrush, and they'll actually dance kind of out in the open or in an opening in the forest somewhere. And they, I've seen them all the way to the valley floor. In fact, I was on a sharp-tailed lek up in Cache Valley, and within 100 meters was a blue grouse male hooting right there. So all the way on the valley floor, all the way up to some high elevation sagebrush sites. So they seem to cover a bunch of ground there. They kind of have what I'm going to term an exploded lek. And we don't really understand this completely, but what I mean by that is they're not a lek species where they're a few feet apart, you know, the males are competing with each other. But it seems like, you know, there's one here, and 100 yards there's one here, and a couple 100 yards there's one here, and they're on this big area. And then you go for a while without anything, and then you'll have another kind of big exploded lek. And it's kind of interesting. They're actually, blue grouse are actually much closer related to a sage grouse than they are to a rough grouse in their phylogeny. We don't know how far the females go to nest from these breeding areas. We don't even understand where they nest. We don't know what kind of habitat they're nesting in. Some information shows that they've nested under sagebrush, but we don't know if they're nesting in the forest, in mixed shrub communities. We just don't know. We also don't know, have a monitoring method to track population trends through time. None of those things have been developed, especially for the duskies. And we don't really understand survival rates or factors that influence those survival rates for dusky grouse. For brooding habitat, is it early successional aspen? Is it aspen mixed with sagebrush? Is it conifer? I don't know. I've seen them in all. I've seen broods in all these habitat types. Are they using them in proportion to their availability? We just don't know what's going on with dusky grouse and their brooding habitat. We do know some more about winter, and there's some studies out of Colorado and actually one here in Utah. They experience reverse migration. So when every other wildlife species is coming down the mountain, blue grouse are going up the mountain. And they spend the winter in these high elevation, mostly Douglas fir habitat. We don't understand, so we do understand that they have about 100% conifer diet, so they're eating needles and buds off the Douglas fir. What we don't understand is, are there secondary compound relationships going on? So if you look at a rough grouse or a spruce grouse, there's some research out there that shows that they're actually selecting habitats and specific trees with lower secondary compounds, so they get higher nutritional value to make it through the winter. They've even shown with spruce grouse, this is pretty neat, they kind of go to 1 or 2 trees is all, and they'll eat off of that tree and defecate, and that will change the nitrogen cycle in the soil, and that tree will become more nutritious with less secondary compounds. And so they're actually affecting their own winter habitat like that, which is pretty neat. So we suspect that there's probably something going on there, but we don't know. We also don't understand thermal cover. So I would suspect that based on slope and aspect, they're seeking out areas that are warmer and less harsh for them to get through the winter. And that can happen at a macro level across the landscape or even at a micro level within a stand. But we really don't understand that. So for life history, and again, most of this is coming out of the sooty literature. So nest initiation, we know it's not 100%. In fact, they've shown that female blue grouse, the adults, will get all the nesting territories and actually keep the yearlings from nesting. And so we don't have that 100% nest initiation. Clutch size it averages, based on the literature, about 7 eggs per nest. They've had up to 10 or a little bit more, but the average is about 7. So they're not huge egg producers. Their life cycle is much more like a sage grouse, a little bit slower in their population turnover rates. We have seen some re-nesting. Nest success so far has been fairly high in the literature, 58 to 81%. That's really quite good for a game bird. And survival for adults is really high. Adult males are 70 to 75%. Females are quite a bit lower. And they do experience what a lot of game birds, and especially grouse, do. As mom starts to initiate nests and take care of broods, their survival tends to go down. The lifespan they've shown, and this is again for sooties, up to 11 years on a female and up to 14 years on males. Again, most of this stuff is coming out of the sooty stuff. We don't understand this for dusky grouse. So moving on to rough grouse, you can see the rough grouse distribution here. It's basically where you're getting a lot of that's overlapping with aspen and where aspen is, although they do use other habitat types. But here in Utah, as far as rough grouse habitat, it's a lot simpler. For breeding, they need aspen. For brooding, they need aspen, especially early successional aspen. And for winter, they need aspen. So they eat 100% aspen buds through the winter. And actually, Terry did some research with a student a long time ago at Logan Canyon showing some of the secondary compound issues. So rough grouse is a little bit simpler. Now, they will use some maple sites. They will use conifer, like in the winter, they'll go to conifers for thermal cover and that kind of thing. But the aspen is what's keeping them there. So for rough grouse life history, they have really high nest initiation. Most of the hens in the population will sit a nest. Clutch sizes are much higher, 10 to 14 eggs per nest. There is some documented re-nesting. Nest success is a lot lower, 39%. It's 34% average across range-wide, so that's taking into account that entire range. And survival's a lot lower, 18 to 46%. So rough grouse have a much faster population turnover rate. So research on rough grouse, this is where the vast body of research is coming for rough grouse, especially Minnesota, some of the lake states, and in the last couple of decades, there's been some projects in the southern Appalachians. And when we look at the literature here, for instance, there's a 10-year cycle that the rough grouse populations tend to go on, and it's pretty strong 10-year cycle, and the scientists haven't been able to tease out why. why those cycles are going on. And yet, we don't seem to see that, based on some anecdotal information in the Intermountain West, similar to snowshoe hares, where they can cycle on that 10 years in other places, but not necessarily here. So, conservation issues. What we don't understand with either rough grouse or blue grouse in the state, and I'm not just talking about Utah, this is across the Intermountain West. We don't understand harvest rate or the impact it might be having on the population. When you look at some of the rough grouse literature from back east, there's this association with access and roads, and the closer you are to road, the higher likelihood you have to be being harvested as a grouse, and the further you get away, the safer you are. With these two species, not only Utah, but most of the western states put these species in some sort of aggregate limit. Why this is a conservation issue, I believe, is because of the different life cycles. So a blue grouse, being a much slower life cycle, has less ability to compensate for harvest compared to a rough grouse, which has a much higher or faster life cycle. So these life histories play an important part. We don't understand population monitoring or trends for these species right now. We don't know if blue grouse are going up or coming down, or rough grouse here in the state. They don't know this in most of the states. They're not monitoring these kind of things for forest grouse. Habitat management wise, what do we give to the Forest Service if they're going to go out and do a project that would help with forest grouse? We don't understand nesting. We really don't understand brooding or winter for duskies. We can probably have a much better guess for rough grouse because of their need for that early successional habitat. If you look at this picture, this is a common picture here in Utah of a mountainous system. We have lots of Douglas fir conifer invasion into our aspen systems. This stand of aspen is probably in that 60 to 80-year-old or more life stage. This really isn't providing much in the way of that early successional habitat for rough grouse that they need. And so there's probably potential to grow quite a few in that area. And again, this is anecdotal, but I have seen blue grouse broods in these early successional aspen stands and using these areas. And so it might be beneficial to blue grouse. However, blue grouse also require conifer. So there might be situations where this would be helpful to dusky grouse. So but we really don't understand these relationships or what kind of management that we need to be sharing with our partners. I'm going to throw this out here for dusky grouse especially, but might we consider duskies an umbrella or an indicator species for these systems? From what we do know, they're using all habitat types in these mountainous systems, from the sagebrush to the aspen to the conifer to the mixed shrub areas. And so they might be considered an indicator species that we would want to understand and look at further. We don't currently understand the influences of livestock grazing or other land uses on these species. Some of the earlier reports, I think there's 2 that I've been able to find, implicate grazing as detrimental to blue grouse, especially during the brooding period. But that wasn't explicitly tested. It was just associated with the habitat that the blue grouse were using, and then there were certain grass heights, and the cows ate those down. So it wasn't explicitly tested. And we know that most of these landscapes have some sort of grazing regime with livestock going on in them. And then again, I talked about conifer encroachment and its possible impacts. So I'm going to ask this question, and it might make some of you laugh. It might make some, I hope it makes you think. So 30 years ago, if you went and talked about sage grouse to a group of biologists, they would have kind of said, who cares? Just a big old bird out in the sagebrush. We don't really need to understand or see what's going on as a larger conservation community. And I wonder if we shouldn't start thinking about dusky grouse as potential to gather some information prior to something like this happening. Just thinking about the history and the story of sage grouse. So we're going to transition into some data, some harvest data. But I want to start with this slide. So all of us in this room understand and know that Utah is a hooves and horns state. That's just the way it is. And actually, either of those animals would be my lifetime record. So I'd be happy to have those. And we understand that from a funding standpoint, from a management focused standpoint, and as it should be with what our sportsmen want. But what I did was, I wanted to kind of see how the upland game program might stack up in some way. So I took the hunter days for the general deer season, which is this orange line, and then I took hunter days for all of the upland game stuff. So this is, I'm just kind of using this as a standard. I think we can all wrap our minds around the general deer season. So if we look through time, we're at about half. So this is the percent of the deer that the upland hunter days are going. So if you look at this since 1994, you're looking at about half of the hunter days of the general deer hunt. So while this is certainly a lot less, it's not insignificant. That's a good chunk of interest and effort being put on the ground by the hunters. And I think it's worth talking about the upland game programs in Utah and what they offer. I also, I don't want to just whiz by the idea of the importance of upland game to recruitment and getting young hunters into the game. And I want to talk a little bit about my nephew. I have a nephew that just turned 12. And this last year, he went out with his dad and shot his first upland game species. And it was a rough grouse that lit on a limb. And normally, ethically, my family wouldn't shoot a rough grouse on a limb. But we let him, it was his first bird. And it hooked him. I mean, it hooked him. And he started going with his dad. He's gone every time now that he can. And he actually shot a chucker on the wing with a 410 single shot this year. I thought that was just amazing.
Terry?
Oh my God, it was a 12.
Terry also shot his first chucker. So I don't think we can look past what upland game offers, and I don't think the state does. And there's some things we'll talk about here that we look into this.
And Dave, there's an important point here. I think I sent Greg a copy of a publication that we just got accepted in Animal Conservation, which talks about sage grouse and why people hunt sage grouse, and it's because of that recruitment, that bringing family together, and that by far was one of the highest reasons why folks had such a demand for sage grouse permits when the state went to that process of rationing them, if you will. And
so as we look across most of North America, this is the species, right? This is what captures the hearts of the North American upland game hunt, and rightfully so. I went through a transition when I was a pure grouse biologist before I left academia, where I might have called that a ditch parrot. But after some of my time in Kansas, I came to realize just what this means to programs and wildlife throughout the country. And granted, I was in Kansas. I was in an extremely interested pheasant state. In fact, for one of the exercises I had to do, I was on the MAFWA committee for pheasants called the Midwest Pheasant Study Group, and we had to put together some economics. And so I looked at Kansas specifically and used the 2006 Fish and Wildlife Service report, some of our 100 members. And we brought in to Kansas in 2010 about $153 million into the state because of that bird. And that is just an incredible thing. And this hunting is a strong tradition, and we hope to maintain it. And the state of Utah has implemented a stalking program to help with that. And I really enjoyed hearing what's going on with the stalking program, and especially when we look at the science, it would say that stalking can help with hunter opportunity. It doesn't actually promote populations. And that's exactly how it's been sold here, and it's a great program, and the hunter participation is part of that program. But I wanted to look at some of the numbers around pheasants and Utah. And so here's the pheasant data. I went back to the Great Flood of 83, 84 and came forward. And so this is total hunters, total harvest, and total 100 days of field through time, and then the trend. And you can see that if you look across that time, we've lost a lot in the way of pheasants. However, there was this fairly considerable uptick between 2012 and 2013. I would probably credit that to the stocking program that went on, but we'll know more over time. And then if you really look since about 2006, 2007, we have things have stabilized a little bit there. But overall, we've lost a lot in the way of pheasants here in the state. Here's forest grouse data, the same data for forest grouse. And you can see that it's been much more stable through time. And in fact, the 100 days of field has trended up a little bit across that time. And so what I see forest grouse as, and we'll talk about chukar in a minute too, but what I see forest grouse is the opportunity to grow in the future and to help support the upland game program. And there's some specific reasons why. So here is percent of upland hunters by species. So this is pheasants, chukars, and grouse, forest grouse. So here, the blue is the forest grouse, the green is the chukar, and the orange is the pheasant. And so you can see throughout this time, forest grouse is the only thing trending up. Things have somewhat stabilized since about 2006, 2007. But I think this gives us some opportunity to look at. Also, when you see this big drop in pheasant 100 days, you can also see this increase about just before that of forest grouse, and it kind of went from one level to the next level. And I think the upland game hunters in Utah were responding to what's available to them and going out. And we'll talk a little bit about land availability here in a second. So this is forest grouse versus pheasant 100 days of field throughout that time. And you can see that the pheasant hunters' days of field has dropped considerably. The forest grouse is stable or increasing a little bit. And again, in that same time period, they've about evened out as far as what the upland hunters are putting into pheasants versus forest grouse 100 days. But here's, I think, where it gets really interesting. And that's hunter success. So forest grouse hunter success since 1985 has been increasing substantially through time. And this is where I think it creates this opportunity for us within the upland game program. In 2006, Dean Mitchell worked with USU to do a survey of your upland game hunters and look at things. And one of the things that came out of that survey was that upland hunters in the state of Utah, the ones that forest grouse hunted and chukar hunted, had much higher satisfaction in their hunting season than the pheasant hunters did. And I think this is why, or at least part of why. And I also, we'll talk about this in a minute, public land versus private land association with the species and satisfaction. So there's an old upland game pamphlet. I don't know how old that is. Dean, do you know?
It started in '63 and was revised a couple of times since then.
So I took the latest one I could find, and I took the range maps out of there. And so we're gonna talk a little bit about this. But this is pheasant range across the state of Utah. But I got looking at that and I thought, man, the Wasatch Front just really isn't. I mean, there might be a few pheasants in the neighborhoods, but that's about it. Same with the eastern side of Cache Valley. So I kind of did that to reflect what might be available now. And so that's kind of what we have for pheasants as far as land. Here's rough grouse range. Most of that, I'd probably say over 90% of that is public land. And then blue grouse is going to incorporate most of the rough grouse stuff. But the Duskies will go further south and they'll inhabit some of these isolated mountain ranges out west. So I just want you to kind of look at that comparison of what's available to the upland hunter and especially access what's available to the upland hunter here in Utah. And then when we add chuckers into that, you can see just the vast amount of places that these public land species offer upland game hunters in the future. And so, with that, we'll have some discussion and answer any questions. But this was a blue grouse that Jason and Avery caught, and I was lucky enough to be there when we caught it. So this last fall.
Jason's actually crushing it to death, and it's getting its last breath of air as its head.
There it is.
We did not eat this brood hen who had she had about 9 chicks with her, so we felt like we needed to release her.
So I have a question about, I've hunted bluegrass. I'm going to keep calling them bluegrass.
Sure,
I'm not
I
going
mostly
dusky,
call them
you know.
bluegrass.
But I've hunted in central Utah, northern Utah, Monte Cristo, down above Fillmore and Fierce. And once I've sort of learned where those birds are, I can drive a long way and park and hike a long way, and I'll almost know within 2 or 3 trees where I'm going to jump those birds. They're very, my observation, very territorial. They're not just randomly wherever. And we've talked a lot about recruiting more people into that. There's some areas, though, if you kind of keyed in and knew where these were, you could sort of zap a population out of them. You know, there might be 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 birds living right there. And if you just hit that little group hard, they're kind of gone. And I'm not sure others would go fill back in that little niche area that they were filling. So how do we, and maybe those are just my observations, maybe you've seen others, but they seem to like their little spots. And so if we push the public too hard, are we risking just sort of eliminating them altogether on a certain areas?
So my opinion on that, first of all, distribution, in my experience, has been all water. So if you have a really wet late summer like we had this last year, they tend to be spread out. But if you have a very dry, then they tend to be really congregated, like you're talking about. So that's what I've kind of seen. And then the access issue, so we put a proposal in recently where we would look at banning birds close to roads and away from roads. There are so many areas in Utah that are so far away from roads that I don't think we're at that risk right now, as a population wide. Now there might be certain areas, like I can think of some areas up Logan Canyon, that get hit a lot and hard and time after time, and that might be an issue. So my answer is a typical
Roy, where are
research. What's that, Roy?
His secret spots.
Oh, you gave Greg your secret spot?
No, he wouldn't. No, anyway, that was my question is it got that ability to recruit new folks, and if everybody shoots everything up here off the roads, are we going to be able to recruit them into hiking back further and further, and at some point, what's the diminishing returns if people aren't willing to do that? The diehard hunters like Rory will go find them wherever they're at.
Right.
But and Jason's and all that. You know, I don't know.
It's a concern, and it's one of the reasons I think Jason and I would like to do some research, is to understand, is that real?